security reasons, Israel has built a barrier alongside its border with the Palestinian state's main region, the West Bank region of the Jordan River. So it is located either in the West Bank region or along the Green Line, the traditional armistice line between Israel and Jordan. Its total length is 708 kilometers, and it is more than double the length of the Green Line, with 15% of it running along it or in Israel, while the remaining 85% cuts at times 18 kilometers deep into the West Bank, isolating about 9% of it. In other words, 25,000 Palestinians are isolated from the bulk of that territory. The barrier was built during the Second Intifada that began in September 2000, and the Israeli government defended it as necessary to stop the wave of violence inside Israel that the uprising had brought with it. The Israeli government says the barrier has been effective, as the number of suicide bombings carried out from the West Bank fell from 73 between 2000 and July 2003, the completion of the first continuous segment, to 12 from August 2003 to the end of 2006. The barrier was initially presented as a temporary security measure in a time of heightened tensions, but since then it has been rapidly associated with a future political border between Israel and Palestine. The barrier's opponents claim that it seeks to annex Palestinian Guide, a land, using security as an excuse, and undermines peace negotiations by unilaterally establishing new borders. Its opponents also oppose a route that in some places substantially deviates eastward from the Green Line, severely restricts the travel of many Palestinians, and impairs their ability to commute to work within the West Bank or to Israel. The International Court of Justice issued an advisory opinion stating that the barrier violates international law. In 2003, the United Nations General Assembly adopted a resolution that stated the wall contradicts international law and should be removed. The vote was 144 to 4 with 12 abstentions. The barrier nearly encircles some Palestinian towns. About 20% follows the armistice line, and a projected 77,000 hectares, or about 13.5% of the West Bank area, including East Jerusalem, is on the west side of the wall. Israel states that the topography does not permit putting the barrier along the Green Line in some places because hills or tall buildings on the Palestinian side would make the barrier ineffective against terrorism. The International Court of Justice states that in such cases it is only legal to build the barrier inside Israel. Suicide bombings have decreased since the barrier was constructed. Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades, Hamas, and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad have been less able to conduct attacks in Israel, which have decreased in areas where the barrier has been completed. The Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Israel Security Agency report that in 2002 there were 452 fatalities from terrorist attacks. Before the first continuous segment's completion in July 2003, from the beginning of the Second Intifada, 73 Palestinian suicide bombings were carried out from the West Bank, killing 293 Israelis and injuring over 1,900. After the first continuous segment's completion through the end of 2006, there were only 12 attacks based in the West Bank, killing 64 people and wounding 45. Terrorist attacks declined in 2007, 2008, and 2008, and to 9 in 2010. The Israeli Foreign Ministry predicts that the barrier's completion will continue to prevent terrorist attacks, since an absolute halt in terrorist activities has been noticed in the West Bank areas where the fence has been constructed. Israeli officials, including the head of the Shin Bet, quoted in the newspaper Ma'ariv, have said that in the areas where the barrier was complete, the number of hostile infiltrations has decreased to almost zero. Ma'ariv also stated that Palestinian militants, including a senior member of Islamic Jihad, had confirmed that the barrier made it much harder to conduct attacks inside Israel. Since the fence's completion in the area of Tulkam and Kalkil in June 2003, there have been no successful attacks from those areas. Other factors are also cited as sources of decline. According to a major Israeli newspaper, Haaretz, a report by the Shin Bet, published in 2006, concluded that the fence does make it harder for them, meaning terrorists, but that attacks in 2005 decreased due to increased pursuing of Palestinian militants by the Israeli army and intelligence organizations, Hamas's increased political activity, and a truce among Palestinian militant groups in the Palestinian territories. According to the newspaper Haaretz, the security fence is no longer mentioned as the major factor in preventing suicide bombings, mainly because the terrorists have found ways to bypass it. So Haaretz identified one of the limiting factors of these border walls and barriers effectively. They can be bypassed. No human-made border or barrier can keep all the evil people on the other side. Because, well, I mean, there are always some evil people inside them. We have to wait for the arrival of the Messiah, Jesus Christ, to establish the millennial kingdom before we can realistically expect total security. But let's get back to this Wikipedia article. Former Israeli Defense Secretary or Defense Minister, Mr. Moshe Arens, says that the reduction in Palestinian violence is largely due to the Israeli Defense Forces' entry into the West Bank in 2002. The barrier has many effects on Palestinians, including reduced freedoms, reduction of the Israel Defense Forces, checkpoints and road closures, loss of land, increased difficulty in accessing medical and educational services in Israel, restricted access to water resources, and economic effects. Farming is a primary source of income in the Palestinian communities situated along the barrier's route, an area that constitutes one of the most fertile areas in the West Bank. The harm to the farming sector is liable to have drastic economic effects on the residents, whose economic situation is already very difficult and drive many families into poverty. In April 2003, B'Tselem stated that Israel has made cynical use of security claims to justify grave human rights violations in the occupied territories. Among other things, the determination of the route of the barrier was based on political relations, the attempt to leave the settlements to the west of the barrier, and protection of access routes for religious sites, none of which are at all related to military considerations. This situation is likely to render the entire separation barrier project illegal according to international law. On June the 30th, 2004, the Israeli Supreme Court that a portion of the barrier west of Jerusalem violated the Palestinians' rights and ordered 30 kilometers of existing and planned barrier to be rerouted. However, it did rule that the barrier is legal in principle and accepted the Israeli government's assertion that it is a security measure. On September the 15th, 2005, the Israeli Supreme Court ordered the Israeli government to alter the barrier's route to ensure that negative impacts on Palestinians would be minimized and proportional. The Red Cross has declared the barrier in violation of the Geneva Convention. In February 2004, the International Committee of the Red Cross stated that the Israeli barrier causes serious humanitarian and legal problems and goes far beyond what is permissible for an occupying power. Interestingly, St. James's Church, which allowed the demonstration on its grounds, yes, so between December the 23rd, 2013 and January the 5th, 2014, a major demonstration against the wall was staged in London, United Kingdom, in the grounds of St. James's Church, Piccadilly. The demonstration was entitled Bethlehem Unwrapped and featured a large section of replica wall reproducing both the Israeli wall's fabric and the graffiti to be found on it. Protesters staffed the wall in order to explain the demonstration to visitors and passers-by. They especially referred to the International Court of Justice's judgment of July 2004 that the security wall contravened international law. The demonstration took place just days or 1.5 weeks after the death of the first Black South African president, Nelson Mandela, and prominence was therefore given on billboards to Mandela's statements. The United Nations took a strong stand against apartheid, meaning the racist system that was fully in place in South Africa from 1948 until either 1991 or 1994. 1991, if we consider the fact that in that year serious negotiations began between the Socialist African National Congress, which most Black South Africans who are politically affiliated still support, and the National Party representing the white minorities government, whereby the South Africans were classified as either white, black, colored, or Indians, and then their rights and freedoms depended on largely on this racial definition. We know too well that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians. The replica wall, which was 8 meters tall, the same height as the actual wall, was constructed as an art installation by Justin Butcher, Jeff Thompson, and Dean Willers, who also credited Deborah Burton of Tipping Point North South. They invited visitors to add additional graffiti, particularly in the forms of prayers for peace. So St. James's Church, which allowed the demonstration on its grounds and permitted its own church building to be almost entirely hidden by the wall, issued a public statement supporting Israel's right to defend its borders, but condemning the wall and the suffering which it caused to Palestinians. The church statement drew attention to the request of the World Council of Churches, which is an international interdenominational ecumenical organization, for all Christians to oppose the wall. Of course, there are many born-again Christians across denominational and doctrinal lines who do, in principle, support it. Although, of course, they don't believe that it will totally solve the problems of crime and terrorism and hatred, and look forward to Jesus Christ's second coming, especially the establishment of the 1,000-year kingdom of peace, the millennial kingdom, for a final solution. So in February 2004, the World Council of Churches demanded that Israel halt and reverse construction on the barrier and strongly condemned violations of human rights and humanitarian consequences that resulted from the barrier's construction. While acknowledging Israel's serious security concerns and asserting that the barrier's construction on its own territory would not have been a violation of international law, the statement called on member churches, ecumenical councils of churches, Christian world communions, and specialized ministries of churches to condemn the wall as an act of unlawful annexation. In 2003, then U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell criticized the project, saying, "A nation is within its rights to put up a fence if it sees the need for one. However, in the case of the Israeli fence, we are concerned when the fence crosses over onto the land of others." In April 2004, then President of the United States, George W. Bush, said, "In light of new realities on the ground, including already existing major Israeli population centers, it is unrealistic to expect that the outcome of final status negotiations will be a full and complete return to the armistice lines of 1949, and all previous efforts to negotiate a two-state solution have reached the same conclusion." In May 2005, Bush said, "I think the wall is a problem, and I discussed this with Ariel Sharon, who was then the Israeli Prime Minister. It is very difficult to develop confidence between the Palestinians and Israel with the wall snaking through the West Bank." The Canadian government recognizes Israel's right to protect its citizens from terrorist attacks, including through the restriction of access to its territory and by building a barrier on its own territory for security purposes. However, it opposes the barrier's incursion into and the disruption of occupied territories. Officially, the Canadian federal government still considers the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, to be occupied territory and considers the barrier to violate international law under the Fourth Geneva Convention. Although the barrier is purported to be a temporary defense against Palestinian attacks, many view it as significant in terms of future negotiations over Israel's final borders. Some speculate that because sections of the barrier are not built along the Green Line, but in the West Bank, the real purpose is to acquire territory. The wall has been used as a canvas for many paintings and writings. It has been called the world's largest protest graffiti. Some of these have been removed by the Israelis and sometimes by people on the Palestinian side. In 2012, 440 kilometers or 62% of the barrier had been completed, 57 kilometers was under construction, and 212 kilometers had not yet been started, with little progress made by 2014. As of September 2014, 8 years after approving the 45-kilometer stretch of barrier enclosing Gush Etzion, no progress has been made on it, and Israel reopened the debate. And in late September 2014, the Israeli government voted not to reauthorize the barrier in the Gush Etzion area.